It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the very kind invitation. It's not just a pleasure, but it's a great honor to be here. The Society has played a very important role in my career. The first public presentation I ever made was at the History of Economic Society meeting when I was in graduate school in 1986. How many of you attended the HES meetings in 1986? So we got 5 people. How many of you were born after 1986? So I feel like I need to provide a little bit more introduction. I started out my career very interested in the history of economic thought. In fact, my first book, which John mentioned, is called Against the Tide, Intellectual History of Free Trade, and sort of goes through arguments about free trade. I must confess, usually, there's a stereotype that you become more interested in history of thought as you get older. I was deeply interested in young, and I sort of lost it for a while, though it's coming back. And I moved on to history of economic policy and trying to evaluate U.S. trade policy throughout history. And that culminated in this book that was just published last fall, Clashing Against Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy. So I want to sort of talk about these ideas in terms of the realm of trade policy, an area that I've studied over time, and see how have economists mattered or not for changes in trade policy that we've seen over long periods of time. I would argue there's been a free trade revolution in the world, where it's not the US and Britain and Western Europe, which has all been fairly well open. Developing countries have really dramatically shifted their policies. So that's what I want to focus on. The trade opening in developing countries, which is really a post-World War II phenomenon, and even more recently than that. And I want to ask 2 questions. One an economic thought question, one an economic policy question. The first is, how did economic opinion change from import substitution to export promotion? That is, if we look at what leading economists were thinking and saying after World War II regarding the proper trade strategy for a developing country, it was not get rid of all your tariffs and go to free trade. It was something known as import substitution that I'll explain, but there's been a sea change in economic opinion on that. The second point, what role did economists play in getting developing countries to open up their economies? And this will dovetail with what Al Harburger is saying about a handful of heroes. How does this policy process play out? Was it an inevitability of history, or were there certain moments in time where economists were in the right place to make the argument for or against certain types of policies? This has some relevance for us as historians of economic thought in terms of the importance of ideas as opposed to the importance of practical experience in changing policies, and how those ideas can, and the interpretation of those events can matter. Looking back, and this is what I'm working on now, we'll say the period from 1985 to 1995 in terms of the extent of globalization, the change in developing country policy is astounding, absolutely astounding. And how it occurred in so many different countries in different ways will be fascinating. What's also interesting here is this is all unilateral. And here's where I want to bring back Al Harburger. Because when you look at each of these trade policy episodes, there are a small group of people associated with pushing the government to undertake that reform package. And so these are just some of the cases that I've been looking at and that we can identify. So what I'm doing is I've been looking at these various countries, trying to talk to people and learn from memoirs and archival evidence, who has these ideas about a different trade regime and how are they interfacing with the political regime to bring about these possible changes. This is the memo, which you cannot read. It's in the IMF archives, but this is one of these eureka moments, which I know we've all felt. They're wonderful periods when you find something you've been looking for. I was looking for, where is the memo that Chiang wrote to the government of Taiwan saying this is what you ought to do? The reason you can't read this is because it was on onion paper. It's a carbon copy, which anyone under the age of 50 won't understand, but that's how you made copies. This is a PDF, and to read this, basically what you have to do is you have to you get the PDF and you blow it up and you read it word by word. Now, unfortunately, it's about a 20-page document. After about page 5, it gets darker, but the first couple pages are really, really light. At any rate, there's a 20-page memo that basically says, well, if you were thinking about really reforming, here's what you ought to do. And I've been fortunate to go to India a couple times and meet Montek and some of the other reformers and talk with them about this period, and there he is today. So these are the 2 questions I posed. Economic thought. How did economic opinion change from import substitution, and what was the role of economists in opening up? So economic opinion, I think, changed because people were looking at the evidence. And what role did economists play? So I guess I would dissent from Stigler. The economists have played a very important role in these countries. Harburger's right. There is a role for economists. But here is where, I've sort of opened up my eyes a little bit, because as a historian of economic thought, I'm always interested in the big guns in the profession, ones publishing in the major journals. Those are the important people. Well, they can be important people, but the instigators of change in all these developing countries are people who got a master's degree in economics, maybe a PhD, and work for the government. And they're in the government, and they're keeping ideas in reserve, and some governments come and some governments go, and they just have to do their work. But when certain times come, and they can propose ideas that can have a great political saliency. So I think sometimes we focus too much on academic economists and not those working in government, working at the IMF, World Bank, and things of that sort.